She didn't scream when they exiled her. She didn't beg. She simply walked through those gates, the snow cutting her face, the entire pack watching in silence. And no one followed her. She hadn't done anything wrong. But someone needed to disappear before the Alpha King returned, and she was the easiest person to erase. What they didn't know, what none of them could have foreseen, was that some people aren't so easily forgotten, and some kings, when they finally discover what was done in their name, don't send a messenger. They come personally. If you've ever felt invisible, replaceable, or discarded by the people who are supposed to protect you, this story is for you. So stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story about Alpha Kings, forbidden bonds, and the women who should never have been chosen, but were anyway. The gates had never felt so final. Ayla stood at the edge of the pack's territory, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the weight of a verdict she hadn't been allowed to contest. The elders had spoken quickly, too quickly, their voices flat and certain, as if the decision had already been made long before she was summoned to that cold stone hall. Betrayal has a particular texture when it comes from people you've trusted your whole life. It doesn't arrive like a storm, it arrives like winter itself, slow, quiet, and absolutely merciless. She'd looked at each face in that circle, searching for doubt, for hesitation, for even a flicker of guilt. She found none. That was the moment she understood this wasn't justice. This was a performance, and she had been cast as the sacrifice. Nobody told her what she'd actually done wrong, because the truth was, she hadn't done anything. The council had made a mistake that threatened the pack's reputation, and before Alpha Ronan returned, they needed someone to blame. Ayla was young, unbonded, without powerful family ties to shield her, and just influential enough to make the lie believable. She was the perfect scapegoat. The word exile was never spoken aloud in that hall. They called it a temporary separation from pack boundaries, as though softening the language would make the snow outside any less cold. She didn't argue. She had learned long ago that certain battles cannot be won with words, not when the people holding power have already agreed on the ending before the story begins. She simply looked at one of the elders, a man who had once carried her on his shoulders when she was a child, and she let the silence between them say everything she couldn't. Outside, the snow was already falling. Not the gentle, photogenic kind that dusted rooftops and made the kingdom look like something out of an old legend. This was the brutal kind, horizontal, relentless, the sort of winter that had ended lives in these mountains before and would end them again without apology. Ayla walked through the gates under the weight of 100 eyes and not a single voice. The pack stood watching. Mothers pulled their children slightly closer, not out of affection, but out of the instinctive desire to separate their young from something deemed dangerous. Some looked away. A few, the ones who knew her, who had eaten at her table, who had borrowed her warmth on cold nights, stared at the ground. Loneliness is strange that way. It's sharpest not in empty rooms, but in crowded ones where everyone has chosen not to see you. She passed through those gates one step at a time, and nobody came after her. What they didn't know, what they had carefully arranged for Ronan not to know, was that their Alpha King was already riding south. He was 4 days from home, tired from weeks of diplomatic negotiation in the frozen territories near the northern border, and completely unaware that, in his absence, his council had used his name as silent authorization for a decision he would never have approved. They had timed it deliberately. His absence was not coincidence, it was architecture. The betrayal wasn't only against Ayla, it was against him too, though that part of the story hadn't surfaced yet. For now, all that existed was the snow, and the girl walking into it, and the gates closing behind her, with a sound that echoed louder than it should have, a sound like something being permanently decided. She didn't look back. That part matters. In the stories told later, and there would be stories, people would say she walked out of those gates with her chin lifted and her spine straight, and they wouldn't be entirely wrong, but they'd be missing the interior of that moment. She didn't look back not because she was brave, she looked forward because she couldn't afford to let them see her break. There is a difference. Survival in exile begins not with strength, but with the refusal to give your pain as entertainment to the people who caused it. The wind hit her full in the face the moment she crossed the boundary line, sharp enough to sting tears from her eyes. Or maybe those weren't from the wind. She kept moving, one foot then the other. The pack's territory disappeared behind a wall of white, and then there was nothing around her but winter and silence and the specific kind of loneliness that settles into your bones like frost. And somewhere north of all of this, wrapped in a fur-lined traveling cloak, already restless with the need to return home, Ronan felt something shift. He couldn't name it. It wasn't a clear signal, nothing sharp or obvious, just a pull at the edges of his awareness, like a thread being tugged from very far away. He ignored it. He had reports to finish, territorial agreements to formalize, a long ride south ahead of him. He told himself it was exhaustion. He told himself it was nothing. But Alpha Kings, who have spent years learning to trust their instincts, know what it feels like when the world quietly changes while they're not looking. And something, in the quiet certainty beneath his ribs, had already changed. He just didn't know her name was at the center of it yet. The abandoned cabin was barely a shelter. One wall leaned at an angle that suggested it had been arguing with gravity for years and was slowly losing. The roof had gaps wide enough to let the snow in, which it did, consistently, indifferently, as though the winter had decided that no corner of the world would be permitted warmth without cost. Ayla found it on the second day, after the first night had been spent pressed against the base of a pine tree with her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the wind move through the dark like something alive and hungry. The cabin was abandoned, clearly. Whoever had lived there had left in a hurry, or hadn't come back, which were two versions of the same story in these mountains. She didn't think about who they were. She thought about the door which still closed, and the hearth which still existed, and the small mercy of walls between her body and the open sky. Survival narrows your vision like that. It strips the world down to the next hour, the next warmth, the next breath. She found wood, not much, enough. She found a rusted pot and a handful of dried roots that may or may not have been edible, and she made the decision that they were because the alternative was not deciding that. She wrapped herself in a canvas she'd pulled from a rotting shelf and sat beside the fire she'd managed to build on the third attempt, and for the first time since the gates closed behind her, she allowed herself to think. Not about the betrayal. That was a wound she couldn't afford to open yet. She thought about practicalities, water source, food, how long the wood would last, whether the roof would hold if the snow got heavier. Loneliness has two phases in exile. The first is the acute pain of the loss itself, sharp and consuming. The second is quieter and more dangerous. It's the slow realization that the days are passing and no one is coming. Ayla was somewhere between the two, balanced on the edge like a coin that hadn't yet decided which way to fall. The days passed. 4, then 7. Then she stopped counting with precision and started counting in terms of how much wood remained and how her boots were holding up, which were more useful measurements. She learned the cabin's rhythms, where the draft came in strongest, which floorboards were still solid, how the morning light moved across the far wall in a way that almost looked intentional. She began to feel, in the quiet and terrible way, that humans adapt to things they were never supposed to adapt to, something like routine. That scared her more than the cold. Routine meant acceptance. Acceptance meant she had stopped waiting. And the morning she woke up and realized she hadn't listened for footsteps outside in 2 days, hadn't held her breath hoping to hear her name called through the snow, was the morning she finally understood with her whole body, not just her mind, that no one was coming. The pack had not sent anyone, no messenger, no scout, not even a rumor carried on the wind. She had been rejected completely, and the silence where rescue should have been was louder than anything she'd ever heard. Far to the south, Ronan arrived home to a kingdom that greeted him exactly as it always did, efficiently, formally, with the particular kind of organized warmth that powerful places perform rather than feel. He accepted the reports, reviewed the border agreements, changed out of his traveling clothes, and asked, in passing, about the weekly pack gathering he'd missed. He was told it had gone smoothly. He nodded. That evening at dinner, he noticed Ayla's absence the way you notice a sound that has stopped, not immediately, but in the quiet afterward, when the absence starts to take up more space than the presence ever did. He asked one of the servants where she was. The servant's eyes moved slightly to the left before answering. "I believe she's been unwell, my lord." He accepted the answer, but something about it stayed with him. He asked again the next morning, a different person, a different answer, this time something about her having taken personal time in the outer territories. He set down his cup with the particular deliberateness of a man who has learned that sudden stillness communicates more than raised voices. "Personal time," he repeated, not as a question. The person who'd answered took a small step backward without seeming to realize they'd done it. Ronan had spent years reading rooms, reading people, reading the space between what was said and what was true, and the gap in this room was wide enough to walk through. Something was wrong. He didn't know what yet. But an alpha king who has learned to trust his instincts has also learned the specific discomfort of being the last to know something everyone around him has already decided he shouldn't. He dismissed the conversation outwardly and kept moving. Inwardly, he had already begun. By nightfall, he had asked 4 people. Each answer had been different. Each answer had been too smooth, too considered, too free of the natural hesitation that genuine uncertainty produces. And not one of them, not a single person in that kingdom, had looked him in the eye when they said her name. He stood at his window with the winter pressing against the glass and turned that fact over slowly. Ayla was gone. That much was clear. What wasn't clear yet was whether she had left or been taken, and the difference between those two things was the difference between a personal matter and something that would require him to dismantle the entire structure of trust he'd built with his council over the last 3 years. He stayed at that window for a long time. Outside, the snow kept falling, indifferent and endless, and somewhere inside the cold dark of those mountains, something was waiting to be found. He just didn't know yet how badly he'd been kept from finding it. Ronan didn't summon the council. That was the first sign that something had shifted in him. A man who summons people is still operating within the structure of trust. He expects answers, he expects cooperation, he expects the truth to arrive through proper channels. Ronan went looking for it himself, quietly, methodically, the way a predator moves when it already suspects the terrain has been altered and wants to understand the alteration before announcing its presence. He started with the records room, alone, before dawn, with a single candle and the kind of focused silence that makes clerks nervous when they arrive for work and find it already disturbed. The logs from the week of his absence were there, but certain pages had been rewritten. Not removed, which would have been obvious, but rewritten in a hand close enough to the original to pass a casual reading. Someone had been careful. Someone had also underestimated how well Ronan knew the difference between careful and invisible. The testimonies were gone. Not misfiled. Gone. 3 witnesses who had been present at the council session during his absence had submitted written accounts, as protocol required, and all 3 documents had been removed from the archive and replaced with blank folios bearing the correct stamps. It was the stamps that gave it away, actually. They were dated 2 days after the session, which meant someone had gone back and replaced the originals after the fact, which meant this wasn't a spontaneous decision made in panic. This was planned. Ronan sat with that knowledge for a long moment in the cold, pre-dawn quiet of the records room, and something in his expression changed in a way that the candle flame caught and reflected. Not anger exactly, not yet, but the particular stillness of a man who has just recalibrated every assumption he held about the people around him. Betrayal from enemies is expected. Betrayal from inside your own walls is a different kind of cold entirely. He found one of the witnesses by midday, a young pack member named Dara, who worked in the kitchens and had been present at the session by accident. She'd been delivering a meal when the council convened and had stayed, uncertain whether to leave, long enough to hear the beginning of the proceedings. She was kneading bread when Ronan appeared in the kitchen doorway, and the way her hands stilled the moment she saw him told him everything he needed to know about what she'd been carrying. He didn't speak immediately. He simply waited, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, giving her the space to decide whether she would lie to his face or trust him with what she knew. Most people, when given that particular silence from an Alpha King, choose the truth. Dara looked down at the dough beneath her hands and said quietly, "She didn't leave on her own, my lord. They voted while you were gone. I heard them say your name, that you'd authorized it, but you weren't there." She didn't look up. "I didn't think anyone would believe me." "I believe you," he said. Just that. No elaboration, no dramatic declaration. 2 words spoken with the kind of weight that made Dara finally look up, and whatever she saw in his face made her exhale for what seemed like the first time in days. Ronan left the kitchen without another word, but his pace had changed, no longer the quiet, investigative movement of the early morning, but something more deliberate, more contained, more dangerous in the way that controlled things are always more dangerous than loud ones. The council had used his name, his authority, his absence. They had taken a girl, with no one powerful enough to defend her, and sent her into the winter knowing exactly what it might cost her. The anger that moved through him then wasn't hot. It was cold and specific and entirely focused, which was considerably worse. Meanwhile, in the mountains, the storm that had been building for 2 days finally broke. Ayla heard it coming before it arrived. A change in the pressure of the air, a deepening of the wind's register from whistle to something lower and more serious. She'd spent the afternoon reinforcing the cabin as best she could, packing gaps in the wall with strips of canvas and moving her small wood supply closer to the hearth. When the storm hit, it hit completely, the kind of winter weather that doesn't negotiate, that simply arrives and reorganizes the world according to its own priorities. The roof held barely. One section near the back corner gave way sometime in the night, and the snow that poured through it extinguished the fire before she could protect it. She spent the remaining hours of darkness huddled in the far corner with the canvas pulled over her shoulders, listening to the storm dismantle the world outside and thinking, with a clarity that only true cold produces, that she might not survive this one. Not dramatically, just as a fact. A quiet, honest assessment of her resources versus what the mountain was currently asking of her. Ronan left before sunrise the next morning. No announcement, no formal escort. He told one person, his most trusted guard, where he was going and why, and instructed him to say nothing to the council until he returned. He rode hard into the mountains with the kind of purpose that had nothing to do with duty or obligation and everything to do with something more essential, more personal, more difficult to name in the vocabulary of kings. Somewhere in that snow, a girl had been rejected and left to survive alone because the people around her had decided she was expendable. He hadn't known. He hadn't protected her. And those two facts had settled into him during the long night, like weights he hadn't agreed to carry, but couldn't set down. The storm had passed by the time he reached the mountain pass, leaving everything white and brutally still. He followed the only trail that made sense, the one leading toward the old shelter grounds, the abandoned structures in the high country that most pack members forgot existed. If she was alive, and he needed her to be alive, that was where she would be. He rode faster. He smelled the smoke first, faint, barely there, the kind of trace that survives a storm only because something beneath it refused to go completely cold. Ronan slowed his horse at the tree line and studied the structure ahead. A cabin so weathered it looked like the mountain had been slowly absorbing it back into itself, wall by wall, year by year. One section of the roof had collapsed. The door was reinforced from the inside with what appeared to be strips of canvas wedged into the frame. Someone had been here long enough to learn the building's weaknesses and adapt to them. Something loosened in his chest at that. Not relief exactly, not yet, because relief requires certainty, and he didn't have that yet. He dismounted, tied his horse to a pine branch, and walked to the door alone. He raised his hand to knock, and then stopped. An alpha king, standing in the snow outside a broken cabin, knocking. He knocked anyway. The silence on the other side lasted long enough that his jaw tightened. Then he heard it. The specific sound of someone who has learned not to move without first assessing whether movement is safe. Careful footsteps. A pause. The sound of breathing close to the door, checking, waiting. Ayla. He said her name the way you say something you've been carrying for a long time, not loudly, not with authority, just with the particular weight of someone who has been looking and has finally found. Another silence. Then the door opened, and he saw her, and everything he'd prepared to say on the ride up here dissolved immediately into something he hadn't prepared for at all. She was alive. She was also not the same person who had walked out of those gates. She was thinner. Her face had sharpened, in the way faces do when the body stops having anything to spare, all softness replaced by something more angular and more guarded. Her eyes, and this was what stopped him, her eyes had changed the most. They were the same color, the same shape, but the quality of them was different. Wariness lived there now in a way it hadn't before, settled in like a permanent resident who had moved in during his absence and had no intention of leaving. She looked at him the way you look at something you don't entirely trust your own reaction to, not with hostility, not with warmth, but with a careful, measuring stillness that was somehow more painful than either. "You found me," she said quietly. "I stopped believing anyone would." Not a greeting, not relief, just the truth, delivered in a voice that had learned to keep its distance even from its own emotions. He stepped inside then, and that was when he saw the rest of it. Her hands, wrapped loosely at her sides, were cracked at the knuckles, the skin split in the way that happens when cold and work combine without relief. The blanket around her shoulders was canvas, the same material she'd used to reinforce the walls, repurposed, remade, into something wearable out of pure necessity. Her boots were worn through at the left sole, patched with what looked like bark and rope. Her fingers were red, not from cold in this moment, but the permanent redness of someone who had been cold for a very long time. He took all of it in without speaking, without letting his expression break into anything she might feel the need to manage. But something moved through him in that moment, deep and quiet and furious, the specific devastation of a man who is seeing, for the first time, the full weight of what his absence had cost her. "I didn't know," he said. He didn't move toward her. He understood, in the instinctive way that some people understand things without being taught them, that the space between them needed to be crossed on her terms, or not at all. "I need you to understand that. I didn't know what they'd done until I came back and started asking questions that nobody would answer." Something moved across her face at that. Not softness, not yet, but a fracture in the careful neutrality she'd been holding. A hairline crack that told him the words had landed somewhere real. She looked away, toward the collapsed section of roof, toward the dead fire in the hearth, toward anything that wasn't his face. "It doesn't matter now," she said, which was the thing people say when something matters enormously and they don't yet feel safe enough to admit it. "It matters to me," he said quietly, without urgency, without pressure. And he meant it in a way that had nothing to do with duty. He crossed to the broken hearth and began rebuilding the fire, not asking permission, not announcing the gesture, simply doing it, because she was cold and he was there, and that was the most honest thing he could offer her right now. She watched him from across the cabin, with that careful, measuring expression, trying to decide what to do with him, whether to trust the version of him that had ridden through a storm to find her, or hold on to the version she'd constructed during the weeks of silence, the version that had known and hadn't come. He couldn't rush that decision. He understood that. He stacked the wood slowly, deliberately, giving her time. The fire caught, and the warmth began to move through the small, broken space between them, and outside the mountain held its breath around them both. Because something was shifting here, quietly, in the way that the most important things always do. Not loudly, not cleanly, but unmistakably. And Ayla, standing in the middle of the cabin she had survived alone, felt for the first time in weeks something other than cold. She didn't have a name for it yet, but it was there. The ride back was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. Ronan rode slightly ahead, breaking the trail through the remaining snow, and Ayla followed on the second horse he'd brought, a detail she hadn't commented on, though she'd noticed it immediately. He had come prepared for her to be alive. That meant something. She wasn't sure yet what to do with it, so she filed it away, in the careful, organized way she'd learned to file things during the weeks alone. Not dismissed, not processed, just held at a distance until she had enough safety to look at it directly. The mountains moved past them slowly, white and indifferent, and the kingdom appeared on the horizon the way things appear after long absences. Familiar and foreign at once. Like a word you've said so many times, it starts to sound like it belongs to someone else. The truth reached the kingdom before they did. Ronan had made sure of that. The guard he'd left behind had delivered the documentation to the right people, and by the time they rode through the gates, the council members responsible for Ayla's exile were already being held for formal questioning. There was no dramatic confrontation in the courtyard, no public spectacle of accusation and defense. Just the quiet, efficient machinery of consequence finally moving in the right direction. The pack watched Ayla return with the complicated silence of people who know they failed someone and haven't yet found the language to address it. Some stepped aside as she passed. A few lowered their eyes. Nobody cheered, which was perhaps more honest than cheering would have been. She rode through them without expression, her spine straight, her eyes forward. The same posture she'd held walking out, now walking back in. Dignity preserved on both ends of the same wound. The council members were exposed within 2 days. The full account of what had happened, the deliberate manipulation of records, the removal of witness testimonies, the calculated use of Ronan's name as false authorization, was presented formally before the senior pack members. There were no dramatic confessions, just the slow, humiliating collapse of a lie when the evidence surrounding it is removed piece by piece. Ronan handled the proceedings with the same controlled precision he'd brought to the records room, methodical, thorough, entirely without theatrics. The pack watched and understood. The betrayal had not been only against Ayla. It had been against all of them, against the integrity of the structure they lived inside, against the trust that made a pack function as something more than a collection of individuals sharing territory. Justice, when it finally arrives, rarely feels as satisfying as the waiting suggested it would, but it feels necessary, and necessary was enough. What nobody had accounted for, not Ronan, not the pack, not even Ayla herself, was what came after the external conflict was resolved. The council was exposed, and the lie was dismantled, and the formal verdict of wrongful exile was recorded in the same archive where the falsified documents had once lived. And then the proceedings ended, and the hall emptied, and Ayla stood in the corridor outside with nowhere specific to be and no clear sense of what she was supposed to feel. Home had been returned to her on paper, but paper and belonging are different things entirely. She had survived alone long enough to become someone slightly different than the person who had left, someone with different instincts, different defenses, a different relationship to the concept of safety. The pack was the same. She was not. And that gap, quiet and unannounced, was its own kind of loneliness. Ronan saw it. Every time she hesitated before entering a room, every time she instinctively chose the seat closest to an exit, every time she thanked servants for things she never needed to thank them for before, he saw it. Each small detail landed in him like evidence he hadn't been prepared to receive. This was what his absence had built. Not the exile itself, not the cold, not the weeks alone, but this. The way she moved through a place she used to belong to as though she was still calculating whether she was permitted to be there. He was good at keeping his expression steady in public, and he kept it steady now, but something behind it had shifted in a way he suspected wouldn't shift back. He had brought her home. He was beginning to understand that bringing someone home and making them feel safe inside it were entirely different tasks, and he had only completed the first one. That evening he found her sitting on the low wall of the eastern courtyard, watching the last winter light leave the sky. He sat beside her without announcing himself, close enough to be present, far enough to give her room, and looked at the same horizon. They stayed like that until the first stars appeared, until the silence between them settled from uncomfortable into something more honest. "You're not sure you want to stay," he said finally. Not an accusation, just an observation offered to someone he'd been paying close attention to. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure I know how to stay," she said. "I spent weeks learning how to be somewhere else, how to not need this place, how to not need—" She stopped. The unfinished sentence hung between them anyway, its shape visible enough. Ronan turned to look at her, and she felt the weight of it without turning to meet it. "Then we'll figure it out slowly," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust everything at once. I'm asking you to stay long enough to let me show you that some things here are worth trusting." She didn't answer, but she didn't leave. And in the cold quiet of that courtyard, under a sky filling slowly with stars, not leaving felt like the most important thing either of them had done all day. She left before dawn. No note. She'd considered it and decided against it, because everything she might write would either sound like an accusation or an apology, and she was tired of being both. She packed only what was hers, which wasn't much, and she moved through the quiet corridors of the kingdom with the careful silence she'd developed in the mountains. The kind of silence that had become second nature now, the instinct of someone who had learned that the safest way to leave a place is to do it before the place notices. The gates were unguarded at that hour, which she'd known they would be, and the snow outside was fresh and unmarked, and looked in the grey pre-dawn light exactly like the snow she'd walked into weeks ago. Different direction, same winter. She told herself it was a choice this time, which made it different. She told herself a lot of things in those first few steps outside the walls. She almost believed some of them. Ronan woke at first light with the particular alertness of someone whose instincts had been trying to reach them through their sleep. He lay still for a moment, assembling the feeling. That pull again, the one he'd felt weeks ago on the road north, the one he'd learned by now not to dismiss. He was out of bed before the thought finished forming, moving down the corridor toward her room with a certainty he couldn't entirely justify and didn't stop to question. The door was open. The room was neat in the specific way that means someone has made it easy for the next person, has removed all evidence of themselves with deliberate care. Her traveling cloak was gone. He stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds, and then he was moving. Not walking, not with the measured pace of an alpha king managing a situation, but with the raw, unguarded urgency of a man who has just realized he is about to lose something he cannot afford to lose again. He caught up with her at the edge of the tree line, where the kingdom's territory gave way to open mountain. She heard him coming. She'd always been able to hear him, something about the particular rhythm of his stride, and she stopped walking but didn't turn around. The snow around her was undisturbed, except for her own tracks leading away from the walls, and she stood in the middle of them, with her bag over her shoulder and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she waited to hear what he would say. He stopped a few feet behind her. She could feel the warmth of him at that distance, which was something she'd noticed before, and filed away in the same careful place she filed everything that felt dangerous to examine directly. The silence stretched. A bird moved somewhere in the trees above them, shaking snow from a branch, and it fell without sound. Ayla, her name, again. The same way he'd said it at the cabin door. Not a command, not a plea, just the word itself, carrying everything he didn't know how to organize into sentences yet. She closed her eyes briefly. "I don't belong there," she said. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but I've been walking through those halls trying to feel like myself, and I can't find it, Ronan. I can't find the version of me that lived there before, and I don't know if she still exists." She heard him move. One step closer, just one. And then his voice came from directly behind her, low, and without any of the careful management she'd grown used to hearing from him. "Then don't look for her," he said. "I'm not asking for who you were. I'm standing here in the snow at dawn, asking for who you are now." She turned around then, because she had to, because some things you can't receive with your back turned. He looked like a man who had run out of armor. That was the only way she could think to describe it. All the careful, controlled surfaces of him had been set aside somewhere between her room and the tree line, and what was standing in front of her now was something more unguarded and more real than she'd ever seen from him. His jaw was tight, his eyes were direct and undefended. "I failed you," he said. "Not because of what the council did. That was their betrayal, and they've answered for it. I failed you because I left without making sure you were protected, and I came back and asked the wrong questions for too long, and every day you spent in that cabin is a day I should have found you sooner. I know that. I'm not asking you to forgive the time that was lost." He paused. "I'm asking you not to take away the time that's left." The wind moved through the trees around them, scattering light snow from the upper branches, and for a moment the world was very quiet, and very white, and very still. Ayla looked at him, really looked, the way she'd been careful not to since the cabin, since the courtyard, since every moment she'd spent trying to keep a safe distance from something that kept refusing to feel distant. He hadn't come after her out of duty. She could see that clearly now. Duty looks a certain way, measured, appropriate, conscious of itself. This looked like something else entirely. This looked like a man who had crossed a courtyard in the dark because the alternative was unthinkable to him. For weeks, she had told herself that survival meant never needing anyone again, but standing in front of him now, she realized that wasn't what she wanted. She didn't want to be alone. She wanted to be chosen. Really chosen, not tolerated, not managed, not kept out of guilt or obligation, but wanted, seen. She set her bag down in the snow, and that small sound, that single quiet sound of something being put down and not picked back up, broke the last of the winter between them. Ronan exhaled, and for the first time in weeks, so did she. They cast her out during winter. They used her silence against her loneliness as a weapon, and her lack of powerful allies as permission. They believed the snow would erase her. They believed time would bury the truth. What they never accounted for was him, not the Alpha King, the man, the one who refused to accept convenient answers, the one who crossed mountains searching for someone everyone else had already forgotten. And what they never accounted for, most of all, was her. The girl who survived when she had every reason not to. The girl who built warmth inside a broken cabin. The girl who learned how to stand alone and still chose not to close her heart. Because in the end, this was never a story about exile. It was a story about belonging. It was never about winter. It was about discovering who would come back for you when everyone else walked away. And when the moment finally came, Ayla didn't stay because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because, for the first time in a very long time, she believed she was worth staying for. Have you ever felt rejected by people you trusted? Have you ever wondered if you truly belonged somewhere? Tell us in the comments. And if stories of Alpha Kings, resilience, second chances and love that refuses to let go speak to something in your heart, subscribe and join us for the next journey. Because sometimes the coldest winters lead us to the people who finally feel like home.